Anna died for 17 hours and returned, claiming heaven wasn't what we thought. It was far more horrifying. Her chilling words shook everyone who heard them, leaving a deep sense of unease. What could she have seen that turned a peaceful idea into something so terrifying? Tune in as we uncover the details of Anna's haunting message that caused the U.S. government to shut down all cemeteries and morgues in the country. Cracks beneath the perfect surface. But if you look closer, you'd notice tiny cracks in the perfection. Her friends would say she seemed distracted sometimes, as if her mind wandered off to places she couldn't explain. Anna would laugh it off, but there was something she couldn't quite shake. It started with small things, a dream of a dark forest she couldn't place, a feeling of being watched when she walked home from work. At first she thought it was stress, or maybe just her imagination playing tricks, but these moments became more frequent, creeping into her days like shadows in a sunny room. Before we delve into this, it's clear that Anna's visions were far darker than anyone could have expected, and what she uncovered won't be the only thing to leave you speechless. Her relationships were steady, but they weren't without their own complications. She adored her sister Megan, though their conversations often danced around deeper topics. Megan was the kind of person who could light up any room, and sometimes it felt like standing in her shadow. Her parents were distant, both emotionally and physically, having retired to a beachside community states away. Her social circle consisted mostly of work friends and a neighbor who borrowed sugar far too often. She had never been in love, at least not in the way people described in books. Her romantic encounters were brief and unremarkable, leaving her wondering if she was missing some vital spark. Her health was another story. While she appeared fine on the outside, she had a recurring pain in her chest that doctors dismissed as stress. She didn't push the issue, but deep down, she knew it wasn't normal. The discomfort wasn't just physical, it was as if something heavy rested inside her, a weight she couldn't name. She tried yoga, meditation, even crystal healing at the insistence of a co-worker. Nothing helped. The night before everything changed, her unease hit its peak. She had a dream, the kind that lingers even after you wake up. She was standing in a field under a sky full of stars, but the stars were wrong. They shimmered in patterns that felt deliberate, almost like they were trying to tell her something. The air was thick with a strange hum, a sound she could feel in her bones. When she woke up, her heart was racing, and for a moment she thought she could still hear the hum. She brushed it off, as she always did, and went about her day, but the feeling followed her like a shadow. At work, she found herself staring at a book cover, the image of a swirling galaxy holding her gaze longer than it should have. Her co-workers asked if she was feeling okay. She nodded, but inside she wasn't so sure. That evening, she decided to take a walk. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that made the world feel sharper, more alive. As she wandered through her neighborhood, she noticed things she hadn't before. A streetlight flickering rhythmically, the sound of leaves crunching under her feet like whispers. It felt like the world was trying to get her attention, but she didn't know why. She ended up at the edge of a town where the woods began. It wasn't a place she visited often, but something about it felt different that night. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. For a moment, she thought she saw movement among the trunks, but when she looked closer, there was nothing. She turned to leave, but as she did, a sharp pain shot through her chest. It wasn't like the dull ache she was used to. This was intense, urgent. She doubled over, gripping a nearby tree for support. The pain subsided as quickly as it had come, leaving her shaken. She decided it was time to go home. The walk back felt longer than usual. Every sound seemed amplified, from the distant bark of a dog to the rustling of leaves in the wind. When she reached her porch, she paused. Something felt off, though she couldn't say what. She went inside, locked the door, and tried to shake the feeling. She made tea, put on her favorite show, and tried to convince herself that everything was fine. But deep down, she knew her life was on the verge of change. The signs had been there all along, subtle and strange. She didn't know what was coming, but she could feel it. Something bigger than herself, something she couldn't ignore. Her collapse was as sudden as a lightning strike on a clear day. One moment she was sitting at her kitchen table, the steam from her tea swirling lazily in the light. The next, she was on the floor. Her body convulsed once, then went eerily still. The mug shattered against the tile, its pieces scattering like a puzzle broken apart. The sound was so loud, it startled the neighbor's dog into a barking frenzy. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a reminder for an appointment she'd never make. It was Megan who found her. She had come over unannounced, a habit that was often teased about. This time, Megan's impulsive visit may have saved precious minutes, or so she thought. The sight of her sprawled on the floor, eyes closed and lips pale, froze Megan in place. It was like time itself hesitated, unsure whether to keep moving. Then panic surged through her. She dropped her purse and stumbled forward, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. "Wake up!" Megan shouted, though she already knew her voice couldn't pull her sister back from wherever she had gone. The pulse was faint, so faint Megan thought she imagined it. She grabbed her phone and called 911, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. When the paramedics arrived, the house filled with urgency. Their voices were clipped, their movements swift. One of them knelt beside her, checking her vitals with practiced efficiency. The other set up a defibrillator, the machine's cold hum filling the air. Megan stood off to the side, clutching the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't stop whispering, "Please, please, please," as though the words were a spell that might keep her tethered to this world. Despite their efforts, her heart stopped. "She's clinically dead," one paramedic said, his tone flat, but his eyes betraying a flicker of helplessness. Megan's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. The hours that followed were a blur. Her body was transported to the hospital, where doctors tried everything to revive her. Each shock from the defibrillator felt like a ripple in the fabric of reality, as though the universe itself was protesting her departure. The medical team eventually stepped back, their faces heavy with the weight of failure. "Time of death, 7:43 p.m., a doctor announced, his voice cutting through the sterile silence. Megan, seated in the waiting room, heard the words as though they were spoken underwater. Her mind couldn't fully process them. This couldn't be real. She wasn't supposed to die. Not like this, not now. The disbelief rippled outward. The news spread quickly among friends and co-workers, each phone call a fresh wound. People gathered outside the hospital, their faces pale with shock. Some cried openly, while others stood in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the vibrant, kind, steady person they knew with the lifeless body now lying in a hospital bed. Megan couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital. She sat in the hallway outside the room where the body lay, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The reality of the situation refused to settle, as though her mind was rejecting it outright. She thought of the dream described weeks ago, the one with the strange stars and the hum in the air. Megan had laughed it off at the time, calling it one of those odd little quirks. Now, the memory of it sent chills down her spine. Even as the hours passed, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The doctors had declared her dead, but there was something unresolved, something unfinished. She couldn't explain it, but the air felt charged, like the pause before a storm. Elsewhere, co-workers and neighbors shared their disbelief over coffee and text messages. The librarian who had once been the quiet backbone of their community was gone. Someone started a fundraiser for funeral expenses, another organized a vigil, yet even in their mourning, whispers of the strange began to surface. "Did you hear about the dream she had?" one co-worker asked another. "Something about stars that didn't look right." "I heard she'd been complaining about a weird pain in her chest for months," a neighbor added. "Doctors said it was nothing. Guess they were wrong." These murmurs spread, adding a layer of unease to the grief. It was as though her death had cracked something open, a door to questions no one was ready to ask. The hum she'd described in her dreams seemed to linger in the air, a faint vibration felt by those closest to her. In the days that followed, Megan tried to organize a service for her sister, but every time she sat down to make arrangements, she felt paralyzed. Her mind kept returning to the moment her sister collapsed, the way her body had seemed to give out all at once, like a flame snuffed out by an unseen wind. Megan couldn't escape the thought that this was just the beginning of something much larger. Late one night, as she sat alone in her sister's house, Megan noticed something odd. The air felt heavier, and the faint hum she had described seemed to pulse through the walls. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was as though the house itself was alive, vibrating with an energy she couldn't see but could feel deep in her chest. She closed her eyes, hoping it was just her imagination, but the sensation didn't fade. The hum grew louder, filling the room until it was all she could hear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Megan opened her eyes, her heart pounding. The house was silent again, but the air still felt charged. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that something was about to happen. Her sister's death had been declared, her body laid to rest, but for those who loved her, it felt like she was still there, lingering on the edge of their lives. The universe seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The first thing she felt was weightlessness. It wasn't like floating on water or the gentle lift of a dream. It was more profound, as if every tether holding her to the world had been severed. Her first thought was confusion, not fear, as she looked down and saw her own body sprawled on the kitchen floor. She should have felt panic, but instead, there was a strange calmness, like she had stepped out of a noisy room into silence. Colors bled into her vision, but they weren't colors she could name. They shimmered and shifted, alive with a depth she couldn't grasp. The world around her began to fade, not into darkness, but into something more expansive, as though she had stepped into a space that stretched infinitely in all directions. There was no floor, no ceiling, no edges, just a shimmering expanse that pulsed with energy. It was beautiful, but it was also overwhelming, like staring directly into the sun. Then came the sounds. They weren't like anything she had heard before, not music, not voices, but something in between. Layers of tones wove together, some soft and melodic, others sharp and dissonant. They filled the space, wrapping around her like a cocoon. For a moment she thought she heard whispers, faint and fleeting, as if the space itself was alive and speaking to her. As she adjusted to this new reality, she felt a pull. It wasn't physical, but it was insistent, a gentle tug drawing her forward. She moved, though she couldn't say how. There were no steps, no effort, just a sense of being carried by an unseen current. Shapes began to emerge in the distance, figures that glimmered and shifted like the colors around them. They weren't human, at least not in the way she understood, but there was something familiar about them. They radiated warmth, a sense of knowing, as though they had been waiting for her. One figure stepped closer, or perhaps it was always there, and she simply became aware of it. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled her mind with understanding. Images flashed before her, stars collapsing into themselves, rivers carving through mountains, a single flower blooming in the desert. Each image carried a weight, a meaning she couldn't fully grasp, but felt deep in her core. Why am I here? She thought, and though she didn't speak, the question echoed in the space. The figures glowed dim slightly, as if acknowledging her confusion. More whispers filled the air, but this time they were clearer, though still layered and complex. They spoke of balance, of connections, of something larger than any single life. She felt a shift, a ripple through the space, and suddenly she was moving again, faster this time. The colors around her grew brighter, more vivid, and the sounds swelled until they were almost too much to bear. She tried to shield herself, but there was nothing to shield. She was no longer a body, just awareness. Then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stilled. She found herself in a place that felt more solid, though still otherworldly. The ground beneath her shimmered like glass, reflecting a sky that pulsed with light. In the distance, towering structures rose, their forms shifting as she looked at them. They were both beautiful and unnerving, like something ancient and eternal. She felt the presence of others again, though they stayed at a distance. Their gazes, if they had eyes, seemed to pierce through her, seeing every part of her being. She felt exposed, yet not judged, as though she were being understood in a way no one ever had before. One of the figures extended what could only be described as a hand, though it was made of light and energy. When it touched her, she felt a surge of emotion, grief, joy, fear, love, all at once, like a flood breaking through a dam. Images and sensations washed over her. She saw her life not as a sequence of events, but as a web of connections, every moment tied to another. She felt the pain of those she had hurt, the love of those who had cared for her, and the weight of choices she didn't even remember making. It was overwhelming, but it was also enlightening. She understood in a way she never had before that her life was part of something much larger, a single thread in a vast tapestry. The whispers returned, but this time they carried a sense of urgency. She realized she was being shown something, though she couldn't yet piece it together. Flashes of a forest appeared, the same one from her dreams, its trees tall and ancient. She saw the stars again, their strange patterns now glowing brighter. And then there was the hum, the same one she had felt in her final moments, vibrating through her entire being. "There's more," the voices seemed to say, though the words were not spoken. "You must understand." She felt another pull, this one stronger, more insistent. The figures around her began to fade, their light dimming until they were only faint glimmers in the distance. She wanted to stay, to ask them what it all meant, but the pull was irresistible. The colors and sounds began to swirl around her, faster and faster, until they blurred into a single point of light. As she moved toward it, she felt a mix of emotions, fear, wonder, and a growing sense of purpose. Whatever awaited her on the other side of that light, she knew it would change everything. As the light faded, Anna felt pulled towards something unknown, where answers seemed so close, yet so far. A city alive, with light and whispers. She found herself standing at the edge of a vast, glowing city. The light wasn't harsh like the sun, but warm and inviting, cascading in golden waves that seemed to breathe life into everything it touched. The structures before her rose impossibly high, their surfaces shimmering like polished gemstones. Each tower pulsed with a soft radiance, casting hues of pink, blue, and green into the endless sky above. It wasn't like the sky she had known on Earth. This one seemed to stretch infinitely, its expanse filled with swirling constellations that moved as if alive. The streets beneath her feet were paved with something that looked like glass, but felt softer, almost like stepping on clouds. Around her, streams of light flowed like rivers, twisting and weaving through the city. They weren't just light, they carried shapes within them, faint outlines of figures that moved gracefully, as though swimming in the currents. She felt a strange connection to these streams, as if they carried whispers of stories she should remember but couldn't quite grasp. As she moved deeper into the city, she noticed beings unlike anything she'd ever imagined. They weren't human, but they weren't alien either. Their forms shifted constantly, blending light and energy with shapes that were both familiar and otherworldly. Some had wings that stretched wide, their feathers shimmering like molten silver. Others seemed to flow like water, their bodies gliding effortlessly through the air. Despite their strange appearances, their presence felt comforting, like being wrapped in a warm embrace. The air buzzed softly, carrying a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't just music, it was alive, resonating with her very being. Every note felt like a message, a fragment of something much larger. She followed the melody, letting it guide her through the glowing streets and into open courtyards where fountains of light bubbled and danced. Each fountain seemed to tell a story, its flowing patterns shifting to show scenes of creation, joy, and sorrow. Yet, amidst the beauty, she began to notice something else. At first it was subtle, a faint vibration beneath her feet, a shadow that passed too quickly to be real. The melody, once soothing, seemed to take on an edge, like a minor chord slipped into a perfect harmony. She looked around, but the beings in the city showed no sign of unease. They continued their graceful movements, their faces, if they could be called faces, serene and unbothered. As she ventured further, she came upon a vast plaza at the heart of the city. In its center stood a tower unlike the others. It was darker, its surface gleaming like obsidian, and it didn't pulse with the same warmth as the other buildings. Instead, it radiated a quiet power, an intensity that made the air around it feel heavier. She felt drawn to it, though the unease in her chest grew stronger with every step. The closer she got, the more she noticed changes in the city. The streams of light that flowed so freely began to thin, their shapes flickering as though they were struggling to hold form. The melody that had guided her faltered, replaced by a low hum that vibrated through her very core. The beings she had seen earlier were fewer now, and those who remained seemed more distant, their light dimmer. She reached the base of the tower and hesitated. The doors, massive and intricately carved, loomed before her. They seemed to shift and ripple, their patterns impossible to pin down. She reached out, and the moment her fingers touched the surface, a rush of images flooded her mind. They were fragments, glimpses of something vast and incomprehensible. She saw worlds being born and destroyed, stars collapsing into darkness, and figures like the ones she had seen in the city, but twisted and broken. A voice, neither male nor female, spoke within her. It wasn't a sound, but a presence, filling her with both dread and wonder. "You are not here by chance," it said. "There is more to this place than what you see." The doors opened, and she stepped inside. The tower's interior was both breathtaking and haunting. The walls were made of the same dark material, but they were alive with shifting patterns of light. The floor beneath her feet rippled like water, and the air was thick with the same hum she had felt outside. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested an orb that glowed with a light that seemed to hold every color at once. She approached the orb, her unease now a steady pulse. As she reached out to touch it, the hum grew louder, filling the space until it was all she could hear. The moment her fingers made contact, the world around her dissolved. She was no longer in the tower, no longer in the city. She was everywhere and nowhere, surrounded by light and darkness, beauty and terror. Voices filled her mind, too many to distinguish, all speaking at once. She felt overwhelmed, but then one voice rose above the rest. "You must understand," it said. "This is not the end, it is only the beginning." Images and sensations washed over her again. She saw the city as it once was, vibrant and whole, before shadows crept in and began to consume it. She saw the beings she had marveled at, their light dimming as they struggled against something unseen. And she saw herself, standing at the center of it all, holding the orb as if it were a key. The light around her dimmed, and Anna found herself back in the tower. The orb was gone, but its presence lingered, a faint glow that seemed to emanate from within her. The voice spoke again, softer this time. "You have seen the truth. Now you must decide what to do with it." Anna turned and left the tower, her mind racing. The city outside seemed different now. The light was still beautiful, but it felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. The beings she passed looked at her with something akin to recognition, their movements slowing as she walked by. The melody had returned, but it was quieter, more solemn. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. This place, this heavenly realm, held things she hadn't been prepared to uncover. Anna's steps were heavy as she moved away from the glowing city. The further she walked, the more the light dimmed, giving way to a vast expanse of shadowy plains. The air felt thicker here. Each breath she took seemed to carry an unspoken weight. Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from an inexplicable knowing, as though her very being was preparing for something she couldn't yet comprehend. Ahead in the distance, a faint glow pierced the darkness, calling her forward like a beacon. The glow resolved into a massive structure, unlike anything she had seen before. It loomed in silence, a pyramid-like shape carved from a material that shimmered like liquid obsidian. At its apex, a sphere of shifting light pulsated, casting strange patterns across the barren ground. As Anna approached, the hum returned, louder now, vibrating through her core with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. She felt both drawn to and repelled by the structure, as if it held answers she wasn't ready to face. Crossing the threshold, she was engulfed in a blinding light. When her vision cleared, she found herself standing in an endless chamber. The walls were alive with shifting patterns and symbols that seemed ancient yet timeless. They glowed faintly, their meanings elusive yet tantalizingly close. In the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in a veil of light, its form indistinct and ever-changing. Its presence radiated both authority and compassion, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of importance. Without words, the figure extended what seemed to be an arm, and the walls of the chamber erupted in imagery. Anna was bombarded with visions, each one more vivid and jarring than the last. She saw cities crumbling into dust, oceans rising to swallow entire continents, and forests consumed by fire. She saw faces, thousands of them, twisting in pain, their cries muted but unmistakable. Yet, amidst the destruction, there were moments of beauty. A child planting a seed, communities uniting in shared purpose, and a single beam of light breaking through the darkest clouds. A voice, not spoken but felt, resonated within her. This is what could be. Anna's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. Her mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what she had seen. The figure moved closer, its light enveloping her like a cocoon. More images came, slower this time, giving her a chance to absorb their meaning. She saw the earth from above, its blue and green surface marred by scars of human activity. She saw chains, not physical but symbolic, binding humanity in patterns of greed, ignorance, and fear. And then she saw a crack in those chains, a glimmer of hope that seemed impossibly small yet unyielding. The voice returned, deeper and more resonant. You must understand, Anna, this place, this realm, is not separate from yours. It is the fabric that binds all things, the root from which all life springs. The choices of your world ripple across existence, shaping not only your future, but the very essence of creation. Tears streamed down Anna's face as the weight of the revelation settled over her. She wanted to argue, to deny what she was seeing, but she couldn't. Every image, every word rang with a truth that resonated in her soul. Yet, a part of her resisted. Why her? What could she possibly do in the face of such monumental stakes? The figure seemed to sense her doubt. The symbols on the walls shifted again, this time forming a single image, a tree. Its roots stretched deep, intertwining with countless others, while its branches reached for the heavens, bearing fruit that glowed with an inner light. Anna felt a surge of recognition. She had seen this tree before, not in the physical world, but in dreams that had haunted her for months. The hum she had felt, the stars in her visions, all of it led to this moment. This is the tree of continuance, the voice explained. Its roots are the connections between all living things. Its branches are the possibilities of what could be. Its fruit carries the essence of hope, but it is fragile, easily lost. Your world teeters on the edge, Anna. The choices of humanity will determine whether the tree flourishes or withers. The vision faded, leaving Anna alone with the figure once more. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to find words. What can I do? She finally managed, her voice trembling. The figure's light dimmed slightly, as if acknowledging her fear. You are not here to act alone. You are a thread in the tapestry, Anna, but a thread that holds the potential to weave others together. The hum you felt, the dreams you saw, they were not random. They were the echoes of this place, calling you to remember. Anna's mind flashed back to her final days on Earth. The strange dreams, the unshakable feeling that something was watching her. It all made sense now, though it didn't make it any easier to accept. She clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her sorrow. Why me? She demanded, her voice breaking. I'm nobody. I'm not strong enough for this. The figure remained silent, but the walls around her shifted again, revealing a new image. This time it was of Anna herself, standing at the edge of a dark forest. She held a lantern, its light small but steady, cutting through the shadows. Behind her, others began to appear, each carrying their own light, their paths illuminated by hers. The message was clear, but it didn't erase her doubt. The voice softened, carrying a note of reassurance. Strength is not the absence of fear, Anna. It is the willingness to move forward despite it. She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. The fear didn't vanish, but it lessened, replaced by a flicker of determination. When she opened her eyes, the figure was gone, and the chamber around her began to dissolve. The last thing she heard was the voice, faint but firm. The path will not be easy, but it is necessary. Go now, and remember, the light within you is the spark that can ignite a flame. Anna found herself back in the barren plains, the pyramid now a distant shadow. The glow of the city was visible on the horizon, but it no longer felt like a place of comfort. She turned away, her footsteps guided by the knowledge she had been given. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, but she carried it with purpose. Somewhere in the distance, the hum began again, its rhythm matching her own. 17 hours felt endless, but what happened next changed everything about life and death. The return that changed everything. 17 hours after Anna was declared clinically dead, the impossible happened. The monitors in the sterile hospital room, silent for so long, suddenly came alive with a sharp rhythmic beeping. Nurses rushed in, their faces a mix of panic and disbelief as they stared at the numbers climbing on the screen. Her heart was beating, weak, unsteady, but undeniably alive. One nurse fumbled to call the attending doctor, her hands shaking as she struggled to form words over the phone. Anna's body, which had lain motionless for hours, twitched. Her fingers curled slightly, and a faint gasp escaped her lips. The air seemed to thicken, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Megan, who had refused to leave her sister's side, leapt from her chair, knocking it over in the process. "Anna," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope and fear. The door burst open as the doctor and more nurses rushed in. They surrounded the bed, their movements frantic yet methodical as they checked her vitals. One nurse whispered, "This can't be happening," but no one responded. The doctor leaned in close, shining a light into Anna's unblinking eyes, her pupils constricted, a reaction that should have been impossible. Megan's knees buckled, but she gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself. Tears streamed down her face as she watched Anna's chest rise and fall, shallow but unmistakable. "She's breathing," Megan choked out, her words barely audible over the chaos. The doctor nodded, his face pale but focused. "We need to stabilize her," he said, though his voice betrayed his astonishment. "Prep the ICU." Hours later, the frenzy had subsided, replaced by a tense, quiet vigil. Anna remained unconscious, but her vitals were stable. Megan sat by her side, clutching Anna's hand as though she could anchor her sister to this world. The medical staff had no explanation. The death certificate they had signed just hours earlier now felt like a grim joke, an artifact of a reality they no longer understood. When Anna finally opened her eyes, it was as if she was seeing the world for the first time. The fluorescent lights above her cast harsh reflections, and the steady beeping of the monitors felt like thunder in her ears. Her body ached, every muscle screaming as though it had been torn apart and hastily stitched back together. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and the only sound that emerged was a hoarse whisper. Megan leaned forward, her face lighting up with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Anna, you're awake!" she exclaimed, pressing the call button to summon the nurse. Anna's gaze shifted to her sister, her eyes filled with confusion. The memories of the hospital room, the monitors, even Megan's tear-streaked face felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. She closed her eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of what she had seen, but the images refused to come into focus. Instead, she felt a deep, unshakable ache in her chest, not physical, but something far more profound. The nurses arrived, their faces a mixture of professional calm and thinly veiled astonishment. They asked questions, checking her reflexes and scribbling notes on clipboards. Anna answered in short, clipped phrases, her voice weak but steady. She could see their confusion in the way their hands lingered on her wrist, feeling the pulse that shouldn't exist. No one said it aloud, but the tension in the room made it clear. This was a miracle, and miracles were terrifying. Over the next few days, Anna's strength slowly returned, but her mind felt like a shattered mirror. The edges of her memories were sharp, painful to touch, yet the images within were blurry and incomplete. She remembered light, so much light, and voices that spoke without words. She remembered a tree, its branches reaching for the heavens, and a hum that resonated deep within her chest. But every time she tried to grasp these memories, they slipped away, leaving her with more questions than answers. Megan hovered constantly, her protective instincts overriding any sense of personal space. She bombarded Anna with questions, desperate to understand what had happened. "Do you remember anything?" she asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything at all?" Anna shook her head, though it wasn't entirely true. She remembered enough to know that she couldn't explain it. Not yet. The weight of what she had seen, or what she thought she had seen, felt too heavy to share. How could she tell Megan about the visions, the whispers, the overwhelming sense that she had been given a message she couldn't yet decipher? The medical staff came and went, running tests and taking notes, but they offered little insight. One doctor hesitated before speaking, his voice tinged with awe. "Cases like this, they're rare, almost unheard of. We'll keep monitoring you, but..." His words trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. They didn't understand what had happened, and they likely never would. As the days turned into weeks, Anna's physical recovery outpaced her emotional one. She walked the hospital corridors, her steps steady, but her mind clouded. Every shadow seemed to hold a flicker of light. Every sound carried an echo of the hum she had felt in that other place. She began to wonder if she was going mad, if the experience had fractured something inside her that couldn't be repaired. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the hospital room in hues of orange and gold, Anna sat alone by the window. She watched the world outside, cars passing, people walking, lives continuing as if nothing had changed. But for her, everything had changed. She touched her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart, and wondered why she had been brought back. What was she supposed to do with the second chance she hadn't asked for? The hum returned, faint but undeniable, vibrating through her very being. Anna's breath hitched, and she closed her eyes. The images came again, clearer this time. The tree, its roots intertwined with countless others, the light breaking through the darkness, the faces of people she didn't recognize, but felt she should. And then, the whisper, "Remember." Anna opened her eyes, her pulse racing. The weight in her chest had shifted, no longer a burden but a call to action. She didn't understand it yet, but she knew one thing with certainty. Her return wasn't a mistake. There was something she needed to do, something only she could do. The decision to speak was not an easy one for Anna. Every time she tried to form the words, her throat tightened and the memories felt heavier, more distant, but the hum in her chest wouldn't let her rest. It vibrated softly, a persistent reminder that she had seen something extraordinary, something too important to ignore. The world outside her hospital window seemed oblivious to the weight she carried, moving on with its rhythms while she remained suspended between her experience and reality. Her first attempt at sharing came during a follow-up appointment with Dr. Carmichael, the lead physician who had overseen her care. He was an older man with kind eyes and a steady demeanor, but even his calm professionalism faltered when faced with Anna's recovery. She hesitated before speaking, her fingers twisting in her lap. I I remember something, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carmichael leaned forward, his pen poised over his notebook. Go on, he encouraged. Anna's words came haltingly. She spoke of the light, the tree, and the overwhelming sense of connection she had felt. She avoided details that sounded too otherworldly, sticking instead to vague descriptions of beauty and peace. But as she spoke, she could see the shift in Dr. Carmichael's expression. The curiosity in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a polite neutrality. When she finished, he closed his notebook and offered a measured response. It's not uncommon for patients who have been clinically dead to experience vivid dreams or hallucinations, he said gently. The brain, well, it can play tricks on us, especially during trauma. Anna nodded, biting back her frustration. She could tell he didn't believe her. The clinical explanation felt hollow, as though it couldn't possibly contain the enormity of what she had experienced. But she thanked him and left the office, her resolve shaken but not broken. Her next attempt came with Megan, who had been her rock throughout the ordeal. Sitting at the kitchen table in their childhood home, Anna tried again. This time she let the details spill out. The hum, the shifting light, the tree with its glowing fruit. Megan listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When Anna finished, there was a long pause. It sounds beautiful, Megan said carefully. But Anna, are you sure it wasn't just a dream? I mean, you went through so much. Maybe your mind was trying to make sense of it all. Anna's chest tightened. It wasn't a dream, Megan. I know what I saw. I felt it. It was real. Megan reached across the table, squeezing Anna's hand. I believe you believe it, she said softly. But maybe it's okay to keep it to yourself. People might not understand. That was the problem, wasn't it? People wouldn't understand. The world operated on rules and explanations, and what Anna had experienced didn't fit into any of them. Still, the hum in her chest grew stronger with every passing day, urging her to try again. Strange things began happening, coincidences that were too precise to ignore. One afternoon, as Anna walked through the park, a child's laughter caught her attention. She turned to see a young boy chasing a balloon that had slipped from his grasp. The balloon floated higher and higher, carried by the wind until it snagged on the branch of a tree. Anna froze. It wasn't just any tree, it was the tree from her visions, down to the smallest detail, its gnarled roots, its vibrant leaves, its presence both imposing and comforting. Another time, while flipping through a magazine at the grocery store, her eyes landed on an image of the Earth seen from space. It was a photograph she had seen countless times, but this time it felt different. The scars she had witnessed in her vision seemed to overlay the image, faint but undeniable. She blinked, and the photograph returned to normal, leaving her questioning her own sanity. These occurrences emboldened her. She began writing down her experiences, sketching the images that lingered in her mind. The act of putting them on paper felt both cathartic and urgent, as though she were translating a language she barely understood. She filled notebooks with words and drawings, her hands trembling with the effort to capture what couldn't truly be captured. One evening, she decided to share her story online. She joined a forum for near-death experiences, hesitating for hours before finally typing out a post. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she debated how much to share. In the end, she kept it brief, describing the tree, the hum, and the overwhelming sense of connection. She hit post and immediately regretted it, closing her laptop and pacing the room as doubt gnawed at her. The responses came quickly. Some were supportive, sharing similar experiences or expressing awe at her story. Others were skeptical, dismissing her account as a hallucination or a fabrication. One comment stood out though. It simply read, "You're not alone. Look for the signs." The message sent a chill down Anna's spine. She reread it multiple times, her mind racing. Was it just another cryptic reply, or did the commenter know something she didn't? She clicked on their profile, but it was blank. No name, no post, nothing to identify them. The hum in her chest flared, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was important. As the days passed, Anna began to notice more signs. A bird landing on her windowsill, its feathers shimmering with an iridescence that reminded her of the beings in the glowing city. A stranger at the bus stop humming a tune that mirrored the melody she had heard in her visions. These moments felt like pieces of a problem, though the picture they formed remained elusive. But the more she shared, the more resistance she faced. Friends began to avoid her, their smiles strained and their conversations shallow. Even Megan grew distant, her concern for Anna's well-being morphing into something more guarded. "I'm just worried about you," Megan said one night, her tone careful. "It feels like you're obsessed with this. Maybe it's time to let it go." Anna couldn't let it go. The hum was relentless, a constant reminder that her story wasn't just hers. It was meant for others, though she didn't yet know how to make them listen. Her frustration grew, feeding into the tension between her and those she loved. The more she tried to explain, the more isolated she felt. And then the warnings began. They were subtle at first, strange phone calls with no one on the other end, emails that disappeared from her inbox before she could open them. One night, as she walked home from the grocery store, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, but the street was empty. Still, the feeling lingered, sending shivers down her spine. Anna's dreams grew darker. The light she had once seen so clearly was now obscured by shadows, the tree's branches tangled with vines that seemed to choke its life. The hum in her chest grew heavier, more insistent, as though urging her to act before it was too late. But act how, and what would it cost her? One morning, she woke to find a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message chilling in its simplicity. "The truth is not safe." Anna stared at the note, her hands trembling. The hum in her chest surged, and for the first time it felt like a warning rather than a call. The truth can come with chaos, and for Anna, sharing her story revealed much more than she ever expected. The woman the world watched. When Anna's story finally reached the public, the reaction was explosive. What began as a quiet post on a niche forum spiraled into a frenzy when a local journalist stumbled across her account and published an article about the woman who returned. Overnight, her life became a spectacle. News outlets ran with sensational headlines, debating her claims of an afterlife, the visions she described, and the strange tree she couldn't stop drawing. Within days, she was flooded with emails, messages, and requests for interviews. Support poured in from unexpected corners. People from all walks of life reached out to say they believed her, some even claiming to have experienced something similar. They described their own brushes with death, visions of light, encounters with ethereal beings, and feelings of overwhelming connection. Anna read their stories with a mix of awe and trepidation. For the first time, she felt less alone, but the weight of her message grew heavier with each account. These weren't just stories. They were confirmations that something greater was at play. Not everyone was convinced, though. Skeptics came out in droves, their voices loud and unrelenting. Scientists dismissed her claims as hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation or neural misfires during trauma. Religious leaders debated whether her visions aligned with their doctrines, some condemning her as a fraud or a heretic. Online forums dissected her story, some users calling her brave, while others accused her of seeking fame. The skepticism hurt, but what frightened Anna most were the shadowy figures who seemed to lurk on the edges of her newfound fame. It started subtly, a black car parked across the street from her house for hours, its engine idling. She would catch glimpses of people watching her, their faces obscured by sunglasses or hooded jackets. At first, she convinced herself it was paranoia, the stress of her sudden notoriety, but the incidents became harder to dismiss. One night, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email, but there was no sender, no subject, just a single sentence in the body. "Stop talking. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen, the hum in her chest growing louder. She deleted the message, but the fear lingered, wrapping around her like a shadow. Her fear deepened during an interview with a major news network. The host, a polished man with an unnervingly calm demeanor, smiled as he asked her to recount her experience. Anna spoke carefully, sticking to the details she felt comfortable sharing. But as the interview progressed, his questions took a sharp turn. "Do you think your visions were influenced by outside forces?" he asked, his tone oddly pointed. Anna hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just know what I felt, what I saw." The host nodded, but his eyes glinted with something that made her uneasy. When the interview aired, snippets of her answers were taken out of context, spliced together to make her seem incoherent or untrustworthy. The backlash was immediate. Trolls flooded her social media accounts with insults and threats, while more shadowy warnings appeared in her inbox. Despite the mounting fear, Anna couldn't shake the sense that her message was too important to silence. She agreed to speak at a public forum, a gathering of people who had experienced near-death events. The auditorium was packed, the air thick with anticipation. As she stepped onto the stage, her hands trembled, but the hum in her chest steadied her. She began to speak, her voice gaining strength as she described the tree, the hum, and the interconnectedness she had felt. The audience hung on her every word, their faces a mix of wonder and recognition. But as she spoke, she noticed a group of men near the back of the room, their expressions cold and unreadable. They didn't applaud when she finished, didn't react at all. Their presence felt like a warning. After the event, as the crowd dispersed, one of the men approached her. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face shadowed by the dim lighting. "You're playing with things you don't understand," he said, his voice low and even. "Some truths aren't meant for everyone." Anna's breath caught in her throat, but before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. The encounter left her shaken, her resolve wavering. The hum in her chest felt heavier now, less like a guide and more like a burden. Back at home, she found another note slipped under her door. This one read, "You're being watched." She sat down heavily, her mind spinning. The public reaction to her story had been overwhelming, but the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. The fear of what might come next gnawed at her, but so did the hum, reminding her that she couldn't stop now. Anna sat by the window, the evening light casting long shadows across her living room. The world outside seemed unchanged. Cars passed, children laughed, and the sun dipped below the horizon. But inside her, everything felt different. The hum in her chest was quieter now, a faint echo of the force that had once guided her so urgently. It had been months since her story broke into the public eye, months of chaos, fear, and fleeting moments of clarity. Yet, she felt no closer to understanding the full weight of her experience. Her life had transformed in ways she never anticipated. Strangers still sent letters and emails, some thanking her for sharing her story, others accusing her of fabricating it. She had become a reluctant symbol, a beacon for those searching for meaning in their own lives. But the weight of that role pressed heavily on her, and more often than not, she wished she could fade back into anonymity. The threats, the surveillance, the unshakable feeling of being watched, it all took its toll. Her nights were the hardest. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that felt less like memories and more like warnings. The tree haunted her most of all. Its roots stretched endlessly into darkness, its branches tangled with vines that pulsed like veins. The fruit, once glowing with an inner light, now appeared dim, as though its energy was being siphoned away. She would wake drenched in sweat, the hum in her chest surging briefly before fading again. The questions that plagued her were endless. Had she truly returned with the message she was meant to share, or had something been withheld from her? The visions she had pieced together felt fragmented, like a problem with missing pieces. She wondered if she had misunderstood the purpose of her return, or worse, if she had been used as a vessel for something beyond her comprehension. Her solitude only deepened these doubts. Megan visited less frequently now, her concern for Anna's well-being tempered by the strain the situation had placed on their relationship. Even the strangers who had once rallied around her seemed to have moved on, their fascination waning as the novelty of her story faded. Anna couldn't blame them. She barely believed her own story anymore. And yet, there were moments when the veil seemed to thin, when the hum returned with a clarity that pierced through her doubt. These moments often came without warning, a sudden breeze carrying the scent of an unplaceable flower, a fleeting shimmer in the corner of her vision, or the faint sound of that otherworldly melody she had heard during her time beyond. Each time she felt a pang of longing, a desperate urge to return to the place where everything had felt whole, but alongside the longing was a growing sense of foreboding. The shadowy figures who had watched her from a distance had vanished, but their absence felt more menacing than their presence ever had. She couldn't shake the feeling that her return had set something in motion, something far larger than herself. The hum, once a source of guidance, now felt like a clock ticking down to an event she couldn't foresee. One evening, as she sat alone, Anna found herself drawn to the notebook she had filled with sketches and notes. She flipped through them slowly, her fingers tracing the lines of the trees she had drawn so many times. On the last page, she noticed something she didn't remember writing, a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The roots are deeper than you know." Her breath caught. The words felt foreign, as though they had been written by someone else, someone using her hand. She closed the notebook abruptly, her heart pounding as the hum in her chest flared to life. It vibrated with an intensity she hadn't felt in weeks, a warning she couldn't ignore. Anna stared out the window, the night settling over the world like a shroud. The stars above seemed dimmer than she remembered, their light struggling to break through the darkness. For the first time, she wondered if the truth she had been given was only a fraction of the whole. And if that was the case, what else had been hidden from her? What was waiting in the shadows, biding its time? The hum grew louder, reverberating through her body until it felt as though the very walls of her home might crack under its weight. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on her like a physical force. Anna's gaze dropped to the notebook in her lap. The sentence on the last page seemed to glow faintly, its words burning into her mind. She whispered them aloud, her voice trembling. "The roots are deeper than you know." In that moment, she knew her path wasn't over. The message she had returned with was only the beginning, a single thread in a tapestry far too vast for her to comprehend. As she sat in the stillness of her living room, a chill ran down her spine, and a single, chilling thought took root in her mind. What if she hadn't returned alone? Is Anna's message from heaven a true warning for humanity, or just the hallucination of a dying mind? Tell us your thoughts, and remember to like and subscribe for more.